Hello everyone and welcome to this new lecture. Today we're going to talk about the indirect question, which is a construction that we use kind of frequently, and in Latin it's pretty easy if you keep in mind the exact rules of the sequence of tenses. So let us see what the indirect question is. So the indirect question is simply a question which is reported in indirect speech. So an example is that I asked you, what time is it? So this is an example of direct question. But if I were to report this question in indirect speech, it would be I asked you what the time was. So in English, of course, we do not have the subjunctive, so there are no particular rules for the indirect question. So the only rule for the indirect question in English is that when you're expressing it, you cannot use the interrogative form, but you should use the positive form. So this means that if I have my mom asked me, what did you eat? And I want to turn this question into indirect question, I have to say my mom asked me what I ate or what I had eaten, but not my mom asked me what did I eat, because otherwise that is going to be a question and not just an assertion in indirect speech. So in Latin, we find the indirect question generally introduced by a verb of request or doubt. For example, quaero or peto, so to ask, scio or neschio, I know, I don't know, dubito, I doubt. There can also be other expressions, but these are the most common. Then you generally have an interrogative pronoun or adjective, which can be quis quid, like who or what. It could be utrum if you have an alternative, so whether you want this or you want this other thing. And of course, in the indirect question, you always find the subjunctive mood. So here's a brief example. Neschio quid Caesar dixerit. I don't know what Caesar said. So we have our introductory verb, which is neschio. Then we have quid, which is the interrogative pronoun, which introduces the indirect question. And then we have the verb, in this case, in the perfect subjunctive, dixerit. So the indirect question is very easy to learn because it strictly follows the rules of the sequence of tenses. And if you don't remember it, here is like a sort of summary, a sort of chart which summarizing all of its uses. So I don't want to focus on theory that much, but I just want to focus on practice, on how we practically find the indirect question. For example, let's take a verb in primary sequence. So in this case, I chose a normal present verb such as quero, I ask. So in this case, as for the indirect speech, you have to be careful to identify the correct relationship between the verb of the main sequence and the verb of the subordinate clause. So for example, if you have an action which is simultaneous to a verb in primary sequence, you will have the present subjunctive. So in this case, quaero quid tu facias. So I ask you what you are doing like in this moment, because as you can see, the two actions are simultaneous, they happen at the same time. If you have an action which is prior to a primary sequence verb, in Latin you will find the perfect subjunctive. So in this case, quaero quid tu feceris. I ask you what you have done or what you did. It depends whether you intend this perfect subjunctive as with a completed action or with a simple past aspect. If the action happens in the future and so it is subsequent to a primary sequence verb, I will have this weird construction which has the future active participle plus the present subjunctive of the verb sum. This is not an active periphrastic. This simply means that this construction simply means that the action is subsequent to the one of the main verb. So in this case, quaero quid tu facturus sis. So I ask you what you will do like in the future. Let us see the same thing but in secondary sequence. So in secondary sequence, when you have a verb in secondary sequence, as we know, you basically have a verb in any kind of past tense. In this case, I chose an imperfect, quaerebam, I was asking you. So if an action is simultaneous to a secondary sequence verb, in Latin you find the imperfect subjunctive. So this means that in order to express two contemporaneous action in the past, you always use the imperfect subjunctive. So, quaerebam quid tu faceres. So I was asking you what you were doing, like in that moment, since it's simultaneous. If you have an action which is prior, you have to use the pluperfect subjunctive, because we know that the pluperfect is usually the tense that you use when an action is prior to some kind of past verb. So the sentence would be quaerebam quid tu fecisses. So I was asking you what you had done, like previously, in the past. While for an action which takes place in the future compared to a secondary sequence verb, we have also this strange construction with the future active participle plus the imperfect subjunctive of the verb sum, so essem esse esset, essemus essetis essent. So the sentence would be quaerebam quid tu facturus esses. So I was asking you what you would do in the future. So this is basically the construction that in English we call the future in the past. Okay, this is basically all you have to know when you have to translate an indirect question. So as you can see, if you keep in mind the chart, it's really easy because the translation is kind of mechanical. It never goes out of these 6 cases that we have just analyzed. As a proof of this, I listed one example for every case. Nescio quis pecuniam amicitiae preferat. So I don't know who prefers money to friendship. So in this case you have a primary sequence verb, nescio, and a present subjunctive. And the present subjunctive tells you that the action is simultaneous, so the two actions take place at the same time. Second example, ate peto quid Caesar fecerit. So here, of course, we have peto, which is a present, so a primary sequence verb, and then we have fecerit, which is a perfect subjunctive, which in this case indicates an action which comes prior, the one of the main verb. So the translation would be, I ask you what Caesar did, like in the past, or has done, if we intend it with a completed action. Next example, nescio quis contra barbaros arma capturus sit. So nescio is a present, so again, primary sequence verb, but then you have capturus sit, so future participle plus a present subjunctive of sum, and so the action is subsequent, took place after the one of the main verb. So I don't know who will take up arms against the barbarians, so I have to use the future with will in this case. These examples were, as you can see, were all in primary sequence, and each and every one of them had a different tense relationship with the verb of the main clause. Let us see the same thing but with verbs in secondary sequence. So, Cicero quaesivit utrum Catilina in foro esset. So we have quaesivit, which is a perfect, so I would say that this verb is in secondary sequence. And the fact that you have an imperfect subjunctive tells you that the action is simultaneous. So Cicero asked whether Catilina was in the forum, like in that moment. In the second example, we have, of course, nesciebat, which is an imperfect, so a secondary sequence verb, and victus esset, which is a pluperfect subjunctive. So this tells me that the action took place prior to the one of the main verb. So Cato nesciebat utrum Pompeius victus esset becomes Cato did not know whether Pompey had been defeated. So even in the English translation you have to use the past perfect, which is a sort of pluperfect, as we all know. The last example that I listed is an action which is subsequent to a secondary sequence verb. So we have nesciebant, so imperfect, so secondary sequence, and then this weird form pugnaturi essent, with the future participle active plus the imperfect subjunctive of the verb sum. Incolae nesciebant quomodo inimicos pugnaturi essent. So the inhabitants did not know how they would fight the enemies, like in the future. So in this case, pugnaturi essent just signals that the action took place in the future, compared to the action of the main verb. Okay, this is everything about the indirect question. As you can see, if you keep in mind the consecutio temporum, it's really easy to translate. I hope that everything was clear, and I will see you in class.